And you can see that even in the libertarian movement, like this notion of liberty, for example. What is liberty? And it seems here's where it gets really perverse, frankly.
Okay,
And
now this
I've
is
been
good stuff.
looking into Russian.
Let's go into this.
Yeah. Right. So I'm a little. I have to confess, I'm a little bit. I don't know, distorted by some of the Russian philosophers out there. But it's liberty is good. It is a virtue. It is a sign that says good. It is direction that we go in and we are unified towards the pursuit of good. But it seems to represent in the shared conscience the place that any of us has in society. When you have liberty, you know your place. And we can know that that's roughly what is the embodiment of the belief, because liberty always requires money. If liberty meant doing whatever you wanted, you wouldn't need money. But instead, it seems that liberty is a sign for good, a thing that we want to follow, but which is a constraint on freedom by way of money. And that seems actionable to me, but I always find that that's very offensive to libertarians because it doesn't quite comport with the meaning of libertarianism, even if it's perhaps the sort of ramification of it.
I find this topic really interesting because a lot of the times it comes down to definitions. And look, you're right to call me up. Like I think the term, and at least some of the things that I was implying, talking about, for instance, Dash, was it's not in relation to sound money. Now, there is actually what I would call an accurate definition of what sound money is. I think I've heard of Max Kaiser quoting Aristotle and Isaac Newton, and like they had this agreement in regards to what sound money is. It has certain characteristics. It's supposed to be fungible, durable. Like there is an actual definition. I just think what often happens is, like with Bitcoin, people have different ideas on what that definition is. My attitude is, obviously there's an original definition of a particular word, like sound money. Now, I can't define for you right now. I understand some of the characteristics, but I'm not going to be so bold enough to define exactly what it is. But there are certain characteristics, and I think there is an agreed upon definition. But what happens is over time, people obfuscate that definition. I can tell you, in regards to liberty, in regards to at least how I use it, how I would, how it's
real quick.
Sure.
It's you don't know what the sound money criterion is, but you know you believe in it. So
I do actually understand. I can actually quote you the characteristics. At least now, I'm not 100% certain if everyone agrees upon it.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. To be honest, I'm not. I know there's supposed to be certain characteristics. For instance, it's supposed to be durable. I mean, have a look at gold, for instance. The fact that it can't be easily created. I mean, if it's something like paper, obviously the fact that it can be so easily reproduced, that is not a characteristic of sound money. The fact that it can be transferred easily, that's supposed to be another characteristic. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and name all the characters. It's supposed to be scarce. That's another characteristic. Now, granted, I think you're right. Sorry?
Are these characteristics or are they morals?
Sorry?
If they're morals, who gave them to you?
These are, now I could be wrong about this, but this is the idea that I was working from. This is what you can call me up on. Like, my contention is that there is
call out. I don't believe in call out. Like,
no, well, all I mean by that is critique me on this, because whereas I may be wrong about this, I understood that there was an original definition of what we consider sound money. But I think what happens is people have. Yeah. Sorry, it's like with Bitcoin now.
Well, it's this notion of the ideal. Like, sound money is the ideal money, and I mean, Hayek talked about it. I think a number of economists have talked about it. Mm-hmm. Nash has talked about it, but it exists in this sort of like this notion of what would be perfect. But I don't know that there's anything more concrete about it other than, again, the semiotics value, which is that we go towards the perfect. But the perfect as it is maybe just a construct in our heads. It doesn't necessarily embody any concrete manifestation.
Sure. Well, I don't think it's a Boolean. I think it's subjective, but there are definitely criterias that we use to define sound money. And whereas you're right, I think people have different ideas on what some of these criteria are. I think generally speaking, we have certain characteristics it's supposed to measure up to. In regards to liberty, I do understand enough about that. And once again, this is one of these topics where you're right. A lot of people have different ideas on what it is. But when I talk about liberty along the lines of voluntarism, along the lines of libertarianism, I'm actually defining it within the philosophy of Lockean property rights, natural rights. Now, there is actually there's a science to this. What happens over time is people have different ideas. For instance, I've recently noticed that a lot of people have a libertarian idea of what I would call libertarianism. Whereas I look at it, I'm defining this based off of the non-aggression principle on natural rights. I think Thomas Jefferson defined it as essentially right for liberty is free action, within the limits of the equal rights of other people. I paraphrase, but it has to do with not violating the inalienable rights of other people. You can actually define this within an actual framework, like mathematically. If you define variables, if you define what certain things mean, there is actually a framework that you can work from. What often happens, I believe, is that people have a very different idea of these definitions. And over time, for instance, the idea of rights has come into this category of not just individual rights or what we call negative rights, but people have added all of these other rights that aren't technically rights within the philosophy of Lockean property rights. For instance, positive rights like the right to security, the right to healthcare, all that kind of stuff. And within the philosophy of libertarianism, that's not actually consistent with at least the way in which Locke would define natural rights. And because people have different ideas of what this thing is, that's how we arrive at the problem. It all comes down to definitions. You're absolutely right. Like my idea of the way in which I define liberty, the way in which I may define sound money, even though I don't have a clear understanding of the criteria, is somewhat different to a lot of how other people define it. And even with Bitcoin, you find that people will define Bitcoin based off of the white paper, and maybe this evolving thing. Like how do you
correct?
Yeah, how do we agree on what the definition is?
Well, humans are wired to seek ideals in many ways. It's why when we look at TV, they're only good-looking people. And it's why when we talk about, the president in some capacity, he has let us down in the way that he is deviant from the ideal. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when you see people looking at Bitcoin, like the reason they come here is because it manifests some notion of the ideal. And then when they find that perhaps Bitcoin Core doesn't act in a way that they like, or Bitcoin Cash doesn't act, they go to the white paper and they say, well, the ideal Bitcoin is the one that was created by the benevolent dictator, or whatever your notion, God, even in some cases. That's how I guess humans work. You got to watch out with libertarianism. Like it's an ideology, and maybe it's the right one. But there's a bunch of perversions that I found over the years in libertarianism. Certainly in regards to taxes. The taxes in the United States, people don't want to hear this, are not only 100% optional, but you will be paid not to pay your taxes.
When you say optional, I got to stop you there. When you say optional, in what sense? In that you don't have to, or granted that may be right legally, but what's likely going to happen to you if you don't pay your taxes?